After World War II ended in the middle of the 20th century, a new conflict arose. This conflict is known as the Cold War. It was a battle that involved the world's two large powers, the democratic capitalist United States and the communist Soviet Union, in a war against each other. The Cold War began in the late 1950s and would be a psychological war between these two countries and their allies. The United States had NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which also included Canada, France, Britain, Denmark, Iceland, Norway, Portugal, Greece, and Italy. The Soviets had the Warsaw Pact, which joined them and many other countries in Eastern Europe. The war was caused because Soviets resented the Americans for decades of refusing to treat the USSR as a serious part of the international community. Also, because of their delayed entry into World War II, which resulted in the deaths of tens of millions of Russians. After the war ended, these grievances snowballed into a great sense of mutual distrust and hatred. The Cold War was a competition for total domination in nuclear warfare between the United States, the Soviet Union, and their respective allies. The Cold War escalated when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite to orbit Earth. Both countries had said they would launch satellites, but the Soviet Union was the first to follow through, thus marking the starting line for the space race. Beginning in 1957, space would become another place for competition as each side fought to prove the superiority of its technology and for their own supremacy. Responding to the nation's fear of falling behind the Soviets in the utilization and exploration of outer space, Congress passed the National Aeronautics and Space Act of 1958. This act formed a new American space agency, NASA. 3 years later, President John F. Kennedy was elected with a plan for further space exploration. JFK stated in his speech, "I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth."
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
When JFK announced the United States would put a man on the moon in the next 10 years, it fundamentally changed NASA, ramping up the space agency's profile and creating a huge foundation that still exists today. 1957, Laika, a Soviet space dog, became the first animal in Earth's history to be launched into orbit. At the time of Laika's launch, the technology to deorbit had not been developed yet. There was no expectation for Laika's survival. She was said to have died on day 6 due to lack of oxygen, but the real reason was released in 2002, explaining she had died of overheating within hours of her launch. Although Laika didn't survive, she paved the way for human spaceflight. On April 12, 1961, the Soviet Union launched the first man into space. Yuri Gagarin was the first human to travel to outer space when his Vostok spacecraft completed a 108-minute orbit around Earth. Less than a month later, Alan Shepard became the first American and second human to leave Earth's atmosphere and enter space. On February 3, 1966, the first soft landing on another world, the Moon, was accomplished by the Soviet Union and their spacecraft, Luna 9. A soft landing is when an aircraft lands without the vehicle or anything inside being destroyed. The USSR got the first pictures from another planet in space history. These pictures were from the Moon. On June 2, 1966, the United States spacecraft Surveyor 1 followed up the Soviet Union and was the first U.S. lunar soft lander in the unmanned Surveyor program of NASA. Surveyor 1 and Luna 9 gathered data about the lunar surface that would be needed for a manned spaceflight to the Moon. Apollo 8 was the first piloted orbital mission of the Moon. On December 21, 1968, Apollo 8 left Earth's atmosphere and its orbit, reached the Moon, orbited the Moon, and returned safely to the Earth. Apollo 8 took 3 days to travel to the Moon. They orbited 10 times in 20 hours, during which the crew broadcasted a Christmas Eve special. At the time, the special was the most watched TV broadcast ever. Apollo 8's successful flight opened the door for Apollo 11 to fulfill JFK's goal of landing a man on the Moon before the end of the 1960s. Apollo 11 was the first space flight to carry humans to the Moon. On July 20, 1969, it landed Americans Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin on the moon at 20:18 or 8:18 p.m. 6 hours later, on July 21st at 02:56, Armstrong was the first human and American to set foot on the moon's surface. Televised to a worldwide audience, Armstrong described stepping onto the moon as one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
I'm going to step off the limb now. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Aldrin later joined him, and they spent 2.5 hours outside the spacecraft, ultimately collecting 47.5 pounds of lunar material. They stayed a total of about 21 hours on the moon's surface. During this time, they collected samples to be tested back on Earth. On July 24th, they landed in the Pacific Ocean. This was the first ever manned flight to the moon and back. Apollo 11 effectively ended the space race and fulfilled a national goal introduced in 1961 by President John F. Kennedy. The outcome of the space race made things possible that never were before. It opened up opportunities for communications like satellites and the technology we know of today. On board Apollo 11 was the smallest computer ever made at that time. It had less than 1,000th of the processing power of a small electronic toy. Until that moment, no one had ever imagined of a computer that small. Computers from that time filled up rooms and were becoming even larger. Yet on board Apollo 11 was a computer that would change the future of technology. Within 8 years of the first moon landing, home computers were being made. Scientists then realized that you could communicate through computers, which started the social media aspect of today's society. Today, almost everyone uses a computer and internet. True, astronauts were not sent to the moon to invent the internet. But had Neil Armstrong not made his giant leap for mankind 44 years ago, the communications revolution sparked by Apollo 11 would not have come until much later, or it may have never come at all. The space race and Cold War took a drastic change because of Apollo 11's success. The impact of Apollo 11 on the Cold War was a demonstration of superior technology and allowed NASA to prove themselves against the Russian space program. In 1970, a few months after the lunar landing, Soviet Andrei Sakharov wrote in an open letter to Moscow that America's ability to put a man on the moon proved the superiority of a democracy. The Cold War and space race had been a stiff competition between these two world powers. However, this act gave the United States a lead, which led to the victory of America and the falling of the Soviet Union. In other words, democracy defeated communism. As a result of the Cold War, the Soviet Union disintegrated into 15 separate countries. The United States celebrated as its enemy was brought to its knees, thereby ending the Cold War, which had lingered over these two superpowers since the end of World War II. This marked the end of a 44-year-long struggle between communism and democracy. The Cold War started with a lot of Soviet success, but the United States kicked into gear after the accomplishment of landing the first man on the moon. Therefore, the landing of the first man on the moon was a turning point in history, the Cold War, the space race, and the technology we know of today.